Well, good evening, everyone. We're glad to have all of you here in our room tonight, here in the Hearth Room, and we're grateful for those who are joining us online as well. We know that we have some folks that are joining us, so thank you for using the technology and being present with us. Evening meetings sometimes can be a little challenging, but we are really glad to have you here with us tonight. This book, we have had a couple weeks where we've already been in the book last night here on Wednesday night. So we had a wonderful discussion, and we actually practiced some of the tools that you're offering us. And we found out it's really hard to get to figure out which tools are good, which systems are helpful, which places that you can go for news. Actually, we had a lot of phones that were trying to do a lot of information, trying to figure out if we should believe it. And I think we were about half and half in terms of the stories that we uncovered. I think the snake story was that was fake news, I think, as I recall. I just want to believe that's true. That was fake. So.
Yeah, he says no, it was true.
It was. I guess I was fibbing a little bit. Well, my name is Jeff Lindsay. I'm senior minister here at Mead House Church, and Christian Wynn, this is his program, but he's given me the privilege of introducing you tonight. So Rachel Wightman is the author of this book that we're going to be discussing tonight, Faith and Fake News, a guide to consuming information wisely, which I just think is a great title because that's exactly what we need to do. Rachel's a librarian and an educator and a believer in finding the integration of faith and fact-finding. She is in the Associate Director of Library and Academic Support Services at Concordia University in St. Paul. Go Bears, right? Yeah, and has worked in libraries in the United States and abroad, in one spot being Kampala, Uganda, which I've been there. That's awesome. We should compare notes right there. Rachel is passionate about teaching people tools to be wise consumers of information. She believes it is especially important for Christians to understand and mindfully engage in online platforms in order to love our neighbors well and be peacemakers in our culture. That sounds like things that we want to be about here at Meeting House. Rachel just reminded me she lives in northeast Minneapolis with her husband and son, which is good if they all live in the same place. That's nice. And she has 2 cats, so she's on her way to being that lady. As we were just discussing, you're a part of Mill City Church, which we've had some connections to that church, and so it's a great church. We're glad to have you here with us. So, Rachel, we are glad that you are here with us here tonight. And friends, join me as we welcome Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. I wrote this book. I just mentioned to someone, I actually wrote it 2 years ago in 2021. I finished it in 2022. So it's really interesting to talk about a book that you wrote a while ago, when it takes a little bit of time for things to get published. And so someone just mentioned to me the other day that they had finished it, and it really feels like a book that was written at the end of COVID, which it was. So there's a lot of things that when I think about this, it comes back to me from that time in our lives. But I'm excited to be here tonight. I have sort of some things to talk about that have kind of kept resurfacing even 2 years after writing the book. It was published last year, and some of them are in the book, some of them are not. I hope that you will ask questions. There will definitely be time at the end for that, but if you have things along the way, that's fine too. I like to have conversations about this topic. I think it's a really important one for us as people of faith and as Christians, and so I hope that when you leave tonight, I will not be giving you a list of the best news sources to read, but hopefully some questions that you can sit with and sit with the Holy Spirit and wrestle through and see where you might be led. So with that, I'm just going to pray over our time because I really believe that God is moving even in our online spaces and even as we talk about them. So I'm just going to say a quick prayer and then we'll kind of dive into some things. God, we just thank you that you are present in our world, in our online spaces, in our physical spaces, and that you're here in this space. I pray that we would listen to you and hear your spirit. Amen. So just a little bit more about me. You kind of heard a lot of this stuff. I've been working in libraries for over 15 years. I have a master's degree in library and information science. But I really see this as my vocation as an educator. I'm not going to shush you tonight. I don't wear glasses. There's a lot of stereotypes about librarians that I don't fit. I actually became a librarian because I loved teaching. To me, it was not about the books. It was about how can I help connect people to information. I came to this world from community development. I was actually getting a master's degree in community development. I was working in a library at the time, and one of my professors said the best community developers are librarians because they connect people and people to information. And that's really become my mission, I feel like. I was a missionary in Uganda for a while. I was a librarian there as well, and had the opportunity to do a lot of the things that I'm trying to do in this book, which is help connect people to information, help people be wise, give people tools, and so that's really my heart, and my hope that you leave tonight with some of those things. So I thought I'd start with just like a little bit about how this book came to be. A lot of times when I talk to people and I say, I do workshops for churches on misinformation, there's just silence. It's like such an unusual combination of things, like, wait, what? And so I thought I'd give you just a little bit of history of where this came from, where this idea came from, why I think it's important. Obviously, some of you are talking about this book on Wednesday nights, so you may have already talked about some of these things. But what we're really seeing, and we have seen in the last 50 or more years, is just such a huge impact of the internet and social media on our lives. And misinformation is not new. It's in a lot of places. And I think it's worth noting that, like, us in churches and in places of faith, we're not strangers to division at all. But our world is so more and more immersed in these online spaces, and it's really part of that. And I really felt like people were looking for some guidance on how to find truth and ultimately how to talk to people about what they were finding. And I really came to this book from a place of wanting to connect people to their deeper motivations and values around information seeking. It's not, I believe this when I work with college students day to day, and I believe the same thing there, like giving someone a checklist and saying, like, look here, do this, check, is not enough. That doesn't result in change. That doesn't result in helping people make changes in how they find information. And so this book and the workshops that I do really came out of a place of wanting to help people connect their information-seeking habits to like some deeper motivation and deeper values, particularly for us as people of faith. A little bit of a timeline so you can kind of see how this idea has evolved over time. You said, I go to Mill City Church in Northeast Minneapolis. I live in Northeast, and in fall of 2019, so if you can remember all the way back to fall of 2019, I was having a lot of conversations with my friends, my family, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. People were really wrestling with, like, we were going to go into 2020 as an election year. That's all anyone had on their mind. And we were consuming all this news around the election and what was going to happen in 2020. And I was having so many conversations with friends and family about, how do I talk to my parents about this? How do I talk to my kids? I don't know how to have these conversations. I'm seeing so much division. I'm so tired of reading the news. The news is really stressful. Everyone's saying different things. And I just kept having these conversations. And as someone who studies and pays attention to information, I just kind of kept hearing this theme. And at the same time, I was taking a class that was offered at my church on cross-cultural competence, and we were talking a lot about how do we live cross-culturally in our world that is becoming increasingly cross-cultural. And I kept thinking about the impact that our information plays on those interactions. And so I approached our pastor, and I just said, hey, could I do something around this topic of finding information? Our church offers Sunday morning equipping hours. It's kind of like our version of Sunday school. And I was noticing a lot of the people who offer these equipping hours were taking their vocation, their expertise, and bringing classes to our church. So things like financial stewardship or emotionally healthy spirituality, all things people were already experts in. And so I approached our pastor and said, hey, I feel like there might be space for us as people of faith to use some of the tools that I teach my college students. And so she agreed. And so I offered that first class in 2020. And literally, I think it was a 6-week series. The last one was like March 7th of 2020. And so, that first time I offered that workshop, we were just kind of talking about the news, lots of politics. And that last week, there was just sort of like this buzz in the air about coronavirus. And then sure enough, a week later, pretty much felt like the world shut down. A lot of things happened in 2020 beyond the election. And it just became really clear to me and to a lot of people that I was close to that we really needed to spend more time on this. There was so many things going on with COVID and George Floyd and so many world events. And so my church asked me to offer that class again in the fall. And at the time, there was someone at my church that works, she still works for NPR. And she mentioned that, they were talking about misinformation. And she said, my church is doing a class on that. And there was like that puzzled look again, like, what? Your church is talking about misinformation. And so an NPR reporter visited one of those sessions and ran a story about the class that I was doing. And I felt really grateful that they were willing to highlight that, right? To say, like, here's a church that's trying to provide tools for their congregation. And then a couple other news stories ran, lots of word of mouth. And then I was able to offer the workshop throughout 2021 and then write the book in 2021 and 22. I mentioned to someone I wrote this book while I was pregnant with my son, so I hope you'll forgive any minor errors that you find. I have a picture of me holding him while I was finishing my manuscript. So, and it's been a really cool opportunity. I have since offered this workshop, these workshops in a variety of formats, kind of like this. Sometimes I just come and talk one time, sometimes I'll do several, but at well over a dozen churches at this point, and every single one has been a different denomination. And what that says to me is that questions about misinformation as people of faith is not a church problem, it's a human problem. It's a human question. What do we do with all this information? I had a woman who works with the Methodist Church, I think, and she was telling me that during 2020 it was really hard because in her denomination, and she was at like a leadership level, she was saying it was like people were not only judging what news sources other people were reading, but they were judging whether or not they could be a good enough Christian if they did. And I think that's something a lot of churches have been seeing in the last few years, like a lot of like misunderstanding between people based on where they were reading their news from. And so my hope with all of these things, whether it's a workshop or my book or conversations people have, is just that it would provide space to extend kindness to one another, to practice finding truth and talking about it, because those are things that I think are so important for us. So anyway, that's a little bit about the timeline, how this book came to be. I have filled this book with, if you're reading it, with lots of exercises and questions and discussions, because I really believe this kind of work is discipleship work. If we want to be more like Jesus in our online spaces, there are things we can do to practice that. And I also think that it comes from being in community. So some of the best conversations that I've had about these topics have been in community with people who are asking questions and trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I engage with the news? How do I do it well? So I wanted to also share, I have a wrong date on this slide. I wanted to share this slide that I share a lot because I think it's really important that you understand sort of the heart behind all of this. These are kind of what I call the rules of the road, or the things that I want people to understand about my book and about my philosophy on all of these topics, is that this is not about giving someone a list and saying, here's the best news sources, you should only go here. It's not a space or a book where I'm trying to say, like, I'm going to change your mind on this topic, or we're going to debate a current topic. To me, it's really about giving people space to reflect on themselves and how they engage online, whether that's through social media or the news. space for discussion, like I said, in community, hopefully a safe space about how the information landscape intersects with our faith. And it is those tools, like was mentioned earlier, on how do we know what is true? How do we discern that? How do we figure out what's true? But again, I really don't want to have debates. I think there's a space for that. There is certainly space for people to have conversations about current events. But for the purposes of this, my hope is to give people space to really think about, how am I consuming information? How am I reading the news? Am I seeking truth? How am I talking about it? How am I loving my neighbors well through the information that I seek? And I like to start out, if you have the book, this is in my book too, I just find it so helpful. And I just wanted to read it. This is a passage from Ephesians that I really like, the NLT translation, in particular in light of these topics. So I'm going to read this, I'm actually just going to read it twice and just kind of like let us sit with it just for a minute, and then we'll go on. But I just think this is a super helpful thing for us to reflect on. So this is Ephesians 4:14 through 16, and it says, "Then we will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love." And I'm just going to read it one more time. "Then we will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love." And my question that I would pose to all of you, even though we're going to keep going, is really like, as you think about how you read the news, how you watch the news, how you listen to the news, how you engage with information, social media, what stands out to you? What jumps out at you? What do you notice? I think there's some things here that can be helpful for us to remember in light of how we read or engage with information and how we talk about it. So. Wow, I have a lot of wrong dates on these slides. I thought I fixed them all. I do reuse a few of them. Anyway, this is the framework that, if you have my book, that I kind of follow. These are the things that I have noticed that as I worked with people, as I researched this topic, as I talked with people, these are the things that keep coming up. These are the things that people keep asking questions about. These are the things that people are wondering about. The first is just understanding more about the information landscape. Today I'm going to kind of talk a little bit briefly about AI, because that's been a big change. So like I said, I wrote this book in 2021. I finished it in 2022. It was published last year. So we're a couple years from when I wrote it, and I think we can see a lot of things have even changed in that amount of time. So I think it's really important for us to understand sort of how our world works, right? How do we situate ourselves in that space? Evaluating the news, the information that we see, read, hear. I know that there's a big part of my book on that. And even some of those have had to change in the last couple years. And then ultimately, it's really important to me that we listen to the Spirit, that we're paying attention, that we're discerning how we respond, particularly in relationships. How we consume information is, to me, ultimately about how we engage with other people. So these are the three things. I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about each of these, some different things, again, that are not necessarily in the book, just highlighting a couple of things that keep coming up and feel really important. So some definitions that I just always like to start with, that misinformation is information that's out of context, misleading, or false, but that's not the same as disinformation, and that is information that is intentionally false. And this is really challenging because we don't always know someone's intentions, and to know whether it's intentionally false is really tricky. These terms are pretty loaded, and then like fake news is false information that's presented as news, and that one in particular, that term is very loaded. I actually don't really like using it, so it's ironic that the title of my book ended up with that term in it, because it is so loaded. But I think it's important to distinguish all of these things. And conspiracy theories is another thing that I think gets tossed around a lot. But I think it's important to note that that really has to do with like blaming an organization or saying these people are doing this thing. We heard a lot of that during COVID. And so I think it's important to recognize the difference between all of those. I have another set of verses here that I also wanted to talk about. So a couple years ago, I was interviewed for a podcast called the Holy Post podcast. I don't know if anyone has heard of that one. The person that, it's Phil Vischer's podcast, and he's the one that did Veggie Tales, if anyone's familiar with that. So they did a whole episode on misinformation a couple years ago, and they started with these verses, and I'll be honest with you, I had not really considered this until I heard the podcast. And this is right after, this is like the Easter story, and Jesus has risen from the dead. And so I'm going to read this because I do think this is a really fascinating way to think about misinformation. It says, "So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. 'Greetings,' he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me.' And then it goes on to say, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." And when I heard that on this podcast, I had not put it together until that moment that, like, here is some misinformation literally being spread, right? They were told to say something that was not true. And I think that that's just something for us to pay attention to. I don't know that I have any major revelations about it, except that misinformation is not new. It's not like suddenly there is now misinformation because we have Facebook and Instagram and a plethora of other platforms. People have always spread misinformation. And even going back to part of the very beginning of Christianity, there was misinformation being spread. And I think that's important for us to notice because misinformation can feel very urgent. Our online spaces can feel very urgent. We have all this information coming at us all the time. If you have a smartphone, right, we have things we can keep scrolling and scrolling, and it can feel so urgent. And so I think there's something really helpful of reminding ourselves that it's not new. It doesn't make it okay, but at least it's not brand new. Part of my research for this book, I also looked at this book by a former CIA analyst. This is another book that I recommend. It's called True or False, a CIA Analyst's Guide to Spotting Fake News. And actually what I found so helpful about this book, she has a lot of tools in her book similar to mine. How do you spot fake news? How do you know something's true? But the first half of her book is all history of misinformation. So examples throughout history. And I find that really grounding to have someone say, like, this is not new. This has been around a long time. For me as a person of faith, to be able to know God is bigger than all of this and has been for a really long time. The other thing that I think that I really like about this book that she highlights is that misinformation throughout history has tended to have sort of a little bit of a spike as technology changes. So when the printing press was invented, now we can spread misinformation a little bit faster, right? Because we have this technology. The radio, right? another way for things to spread. So I think that's also something to pay attention to, especially as you think of our culture, our world in the last 25, 50 years, how technology has changed. And that's certainly something we're hearing talking about right now with AI a lot, right? As AI platforms are kind of popping up all over the place. So I think that what I really like is just those reminders that this has been around a long time. And again, it doesn't mean that it's okay or that we don't do anything about it or we just sit back, but to just have that kind of like steadiness. So I'm actually going to skip that slide and that one because I do want to talk about AI for a couple minutes. We're all hearing a lot about AI, ChatGPT, a lot of platforms. And so I also want to note that AI is not necessarily new. I'm not a computer programmer, so I'm not an AI expert, but it does impact the way we find information. One of my colleagues just gave a presentation today about AI for some of our faculty at Concordia, and we were talking about how, we've been using AI for a long time. Things like facial recognition, right? My phone. Like you can have your phone set up so it recognizes your face and logs you in, right? That is a form of AI. And my colleague did a really good job of talking about how AI are things that humans can do and now artificial intelligence is doing. So things like facial recognition, things like Alexa and Siri, all of that, ChatGPT. But what we are seeing right now is a lot of new applications of AI, and I do think it's something we should be aware of, we should be paying attention to. I work in education, so we're talking a lot about how do we help students use AI, ChatGPT in ways that are ethical, right? And that's obviously a really important topic for all of us to pay attention to. Artificial intelligence platforms are taking data and then repackaging it for us. And there's some really cool applications of that in terms of even when I build these slides in a program called Canva, it has an AI assistant. I can ask it to try to make an image for me, right? That could be really helpful if I'm having trouble finding one that I can use. But there are a lot of scary things about AI. And so it is something we need to be aware of. There's also the possibility for misinformation to spread because, again, it's taking all this information and repackaging it. And so it's definitely having a big impact on the news and the information that we see. I think it's something we really do need to be aware of. And so I just think it's worth calling out. I think it's a lot has happened in the last couple of years regarding AI. And so this is sort of related to that. You may have talked about this a little bit already if you are part of that book study. But this is a graphic that I was not able to include in my book that I think really summarizes this whole idea really well around algorithms and how we see what we see online. And I know it's really tiny, so I'm actually going to read it to you so you can kind of get a sense of what it says. And I would just ask that as we think about this, that we think about the impact on us as a culture, as Christians who are trying to be in the world, right, and engage with our neighbors. What is the impact if we all see different things, right? If our realities are different, what is the impact on our relationships, on our faith, on how we talk about faith? And the algorithms that they're on all the platforms, right? They take our data, they're keeping track of all this stuff, and then they personalize what we see. This is on Amazon. This is, what you see on Amazon because you searched for something in the past. That's an example of how a tiny way an algorithm will work. I was talking about this with a group once, and someone was like, I like my Target coupons are personalized. I'm like, yeah, I get it. That is nice, right? But there's a lot of things that we don't see when we have platforms like this. And I don't share this because I feel like it's worth us all getting scared and turning off our phones forever. I think it's just we need to be aware of this and how we interact with each other. So this came out of a nonprofit organization called Project Information Literacy. They did a whole study on algorithms, but I just really like their graphic. So I'm just going to read through this. And again, I just ask that you kind of think about how does this impact my relationships? Maybe you have people in your life right now where you're living in slightly different realities. And what do we do with that? How do we respond? And so this says life in the age of algorithms. And so now I'm going to read you a bedtime story, so please don't fall asleep. No, I'm just kidding. anyway, this says data are everywhere, collected 24/7 and processed in real time and at vast scale. So that data is really across all of these platforms. You've seen this. Everyone talks about this, right? I was talking to so-and-so about buying new shoes, and then they showed up on my feed, right? We all talk about that. But it really, I mean, these platforms are paying attention where your IP address is, where you're located, what you've searched for in the past, what you've clicked on, what you've paused on, any of that. I like to tell my students that the data that's collected on them is different than on me, right? Because we're just searching different kinds of things. We're doing different things online. Then the next line says platforms. So these could be any platforms. It could be something like Google. It could be Facebook, Instagram. My college students use TikTok. Any of those platforms, Amazon, whatever. Platforms seek behaviors in data to try to predict and influence behavior. And I think that piece is really important, influence behavior. There's a little picture on there. The person's typing on a laptop. It says likes cats, right? So they're searching for cats. More cats. Let's show them more cats. Oh, look, cat food is 50% off. Maybe they'll buy that, right? There's a little bit of that influencing behavior monetary piece right there. The next part in the middle, it says So influence behavior and personalized news and advertising based on guesses about individual preferences. And then the last part in the lower right says creating the potential for us to experience different realities. The person on the left is typing and says climate change is a flat out hoax. The person on the right is saying, will we survive climate change? It might sound kind of extreme, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that we could be living and literally seeing different information on things. It goes on to say, our lives are increasingly influenced by decision-making systems that build on correlations using artificial intelligence software that relies on incomplete data to make generalizations. That's another thing about AI, right? It doesn't have all the data. It has a lot of data, but it might not have everything. And it amplifies existing biases at large. Information systems we depend on are shaped by a tech culture marked by narrow perspective and overconfidence that rely on mining users' data and manipulating their behavior in ways that undermine our trust in news, politics, and each other. And it does feel kind of extreme, but I don't know about any of you, but during, like for example, during COVID, I can think of examples where I was listening to my news sources, and I would have ideas about how I needed to live my life or respond. I'm not from Minnesota, so my family lives in a lot of different states. My siblings and I, there's 5 of us, we all live in different states, and my parents live in different states. So it's a lot of places that my family was getting information from, and then we are supposed to try to figure out what we're gonna do for the holidays. It was really, really challenging. Because we literally were all seeing different information. I can remember times where I would be talking about something and one of my family members would say, I really don't know what you're talking about. And I might, in my better moments, ask, hey, can you just tell me a little bit about where you got your news from? It's hard to do that in a way that doesn't sound like, what are you thinking? And so sometimes I would go to other news sources that I knew maybe they were looking at, and the topics that were being discussed were radically different. And it made it really challenging, right? To me, this comes back to the relationships, right? How do we get together as a family for the holidays if we all have different perceptions of what's happening in the world? Obviously, that was a global pandemic and a huge thing happening, but I do think that it happens in smaller ways, even on the news that's happening today. And I think it's something for us as people of faith who want to love our neighbors well. We need to be aware that they might be seeing different things about our world, right? And so this graphic, to me, I just feel like they did such a good job of summarizing what is happening in our lives in like 4 lines of images, right? It's not very long, and it's a good summary, I think, of what we're seeing. It's a little bit dated, right? There's a Twitter thing on there, which Twitter doesn't exist anymore. But I do think it's something that we can pay attention to, and my question for all of you would just be to notice and pay attention and think about, where do you get your information from, and where do your loved ones get their information from, and is that part of why maybe it's hard to talk to each other sometimes? I know for me that sometimes that is challenging. So I'm going to go ahead and switch gears and just talk about two other things that I think are really important. So when I am talking with folks, we talk a lot about this whole idea of our filter bubbles, our echo chambers, what does information look like, all of those definitions. But then there comes a time where it's like, how do we evaluate what we're finding? And I know that you guys did some work with that last night. How do we know what's true? How do we evaluate it? And what I have found, and what I'm going to talk about tonight, is that a big part of this work is also noticing ourselves. I'm actually not going to talk about any tools for fact-checking tonight. I think you did some of that last night, and I think there's lots in there that will help you with that. I have found over and over again that the emotional piece of this is also really important and not one that we talk about enough. Before we do fact-checking, I think it's really important for us to check our emotions. And this is like a habit that we can cultivate to help us pause and discern how we want to engage with information in a way that's wise and kind. There's a lot of studies about this. Shockingly, I still think it's amazing that they can study this. But this is a study from 2018 that showed that fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. And according to researchers, this is because fake news grabs our attention more than authentic information. Fake news items usually have high emotional content and contain unexpected information, which inevitably means that they will be shared and reposted more often. This is not surprising to probably any of us in the room, but I think it's sobering to be reminded that that's part of how misinformation spreads. And as people of faith, we don't want to be part of that, right? We want to be truth tellers. We want to share things that are true. And when it's human, it's like a human thing, right? We see something that's outrageous or exciting or whatever, and it's really easy to share without really knowing. I think not this last Thanksgiving, but the one before, there was all this talk about how turkeys were really expensive. Does anyone remember this? And they were more expensive. And I remember having conversations with people where they're like, I heard that turkeys are costing $200. But it was growing, right? It's like that game of telephone where it just kind of grew. And that's a silly example. But it was emotional, right? Can you believe this? And then it just kind of even just by word of mouth, people were talking about it. And so I think we can all think of examples where there are emotional things. And I'm not just talking about anger or sadness, right? It could be any emotion that just feels really strong. And another study, so this is what I want to focus on. Another study more recently from 2021 showed that people who exhibited emotional intelligence were more likely to be able to identify misinformation. So in this study, they gave participants an emotional intelligence test, I guess, to kind of see how emotionally intelligent they were. And then after they rated that, they gave them misinformation or news stories and had them evaluate if it was true or not. And what they found was that as people were more emotionally intelligent, they were more likely to be able to identify misinformation, which I think really speaks to that ability to notice emotions. So emotional intelligence is our own ability to notice our emotions and emotions of others, and to be able to pay attention to that. And it's not a skill some of us ever learned in school. And so I think that this is one area where we can really slow down. By taking the time to notice ourselves, we can then decide how we want to respond, right? If we don't take the pause for ourselves, it's easier to just jump right in, share things, whatever. And I think that this study is super powerful, and I've been coming back to it a lot. I've been trying to find more research on who else is doing this kind of research, and I think that this is a growing area of what people are researching. I have an example, and then I'm going to go back to something else. This was an example from last summer that I think is a good example of emotional content. This was a story run by Relevant Magazine, and they reported how someone used AI to create photos of satanic figurines at Hobby Lobby. It was not real, but it got shared so much. It was totally not true, but it was very emotional. I mean, people were like outraged and like ready to boycott Hobby Lobby because how could they sell these things? And it was not true at all. And I think it really speaks to like, if we're not pausing and noticing and saying, whoa, really makes me angry or upset, it's really easy to just share things in that, like, can you believe this type of way, right? And so this is just from last summer, also an example of AI and the ability to create content. And so I think it was just such a good example to me of like, these photos weren't real, but they got shared. I mean, I think it was like, it was so many times. I'm actually not going to give you a number because I can't remember, and I don't want to say something that's not right. So it was so much, and it was in the news, and it was a really big deal. So I just think it's such a good example of how if we're not paying attention to ourselves, it's really easy to share things. And I don't mean that in a way that I don't mean to shame anyone around that. I think that's a very human nature thing to do. But that's one area where I think maybe we have the opportunity to grow a little bit and to say, okay, how can I become a little bit more emotionally aware so that I can slow down and be part of saying like, okay, how can I maybe slow down what's happening, not share things that are not true. We don't want to do that, right? As people of faith, we don't want to share misinformation. So I have a tool. This is in my book. So I'm pretty open in that book and in my life that in 2020, I also had the opportunity to engage in something called dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a very intense form of therapy where you meet with a group every week. And then you have group therapy once a week. You have therapy individually with a therapist once a week, and it's very focused on providing tools and focused on mindfulness and that emotional intelligence. It was very powerful for me. And one of the things that we did, so in our group therapy sessions, we started every week with a mindfulness exercise, which was a chance for us to just like notice ourselves. And that's one way to practice emotional intelligence, is just noticing ourselves. And they gave us a lot of ways to do that. Sometimes it would just be like sitting quietly. Sometimes it would be doing a body scan. And it was usually only like 3 or 4 minutes. It was not very long, but just a chance for us to notice ourselves in space. And one time we did this because it was 2020 and there was an election happening. And they actually had us pull out our phones. And this exercise is in my book because it's just so powerful. They said, pull out your phone, look through some news, and when you see something that catches you and you notice that you have sort of an emotional reaction to it, pause, stop, name the emotion that you feel from that news story, and then in your mind, because we didn't have time to write it out, but I suppose you could, just rewrite the facts of that story in non-emotional language. The who, the what, the where, the when. Not your reaction, not your interpretation, just like, so-and-so gave a speech, right? Just that's what happened. And then you can decide how you want to respond, right? Because you've taken the time to notice those things. And I feel like this has just been a really helpful tool. I don't do it every day. I'm not saying you should do this every time you read a news story, because then you would never read the news. But I do think it can be a helpful way for us to just notice our own emotions and then decide how we want to respond. Because again, I really think it comes down to that response and how we want to engage with other people. So that is the emotional piece. When I just recently, if this is an area, this idea of growing in emotional intelligence, if that's something that's interesting to you, there's a lot of benefits to it besides maybe identifying misinformation. But someone just recommended an app to me, if you have a smartphone. It's called How We Feel. And it just prompts you once or twice a day to just notice your emotion and just pick it and maybe notice, like, you can leave a note on like what you were doing at the time. And it's just a really easy way to just practice noticing kind of what's happening in you and what you're feeling. And I think it's a free app. It's really great. And I've noticed a lot of patterns that way, even in my own self. Like, oh, wow, every time I commute, I get really cranky, just things like that. Sometimes they can be more powerful than that, but even just small things can really help us grow in that way and be more aware of ourselves so that we can respond wisely. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, because I do think ultimately it comes down to our relationships, is how do we respond, right? As we engage online, as we notice ourselves, as we engage with the people around us, as we engage with news, how do we respond in life? How do we take these things and how do we respond to the people around us? And what I've found in a lot of my conversations with folks is that it really comes down to, we have a couple responses. There's more, of course, I'm sure, but these are two that a lot of people talk about. Humility. How do we learn something new? How do we learn to say, I don't know? How do we say, and I'm not saying like we don't have these core truths of our faith, but like in the world around us, are there things that when we fact check something and we say, oh, this one, I mean, you guys were all joking about a news story or something, right? Like, can we say like, oh, wow, that was actually true or not, and be okay with the answer? A lot of times that term fake news gets thrown around just because I disagree with you and I don't want to listen to you, right? So what does it look like for us as people of faith who are called to be humble, to practice that humility in the relationships that we have? And what does that look like for us to be kind as we engage with other people? I'm going to be honest with you, this is the hardest part of all of this, even for me. How do I can check something, I can decide if it's true or not, but there's also a lot of research, I don't have it yet, but I will get to it, that like it's really hard for us if we have really strong convictions to like hear something that's different and believe it. And so these are things that I think we all wrestle with. And so we're going to talk through a few of them tonight. And then, like I said, hopefully you just leave with some thoughts and maybe some promptings. Before I do that, I want to read a little excerpt. When I first started doing these workshops, I had a former colleague. I used to work actually down this way at Normandale Community College. And I had a former colleague who heard about my work with churches and sent me this quote from Howard Thurman, and he was the dean of the chapel at Howard University and then Boston University, and he has a book on different meditations, and it's like a little devotional. And I actually this is an excerpt of the quote on the screen, but I'm going to read the longer version out of the book because I think it's really powerful to think about. And it's a good example of how we practice some of that humility. And so again, this is from Howard Thurman, and it's from his book, Meditations of the Heart. And he says, I will keep my heart open this day to all things that commend themselves to me as truth. I will try to increase my sensitivity to error, that it may not enter my heart with its distortions and falseness. This is not easy. I am never free from the possibility of being mistaken. Deep within myself, I will be still, that I may be guided and wizened by the Spirit of God. In my own way, I will work out little tests by which I may discern truth from error. Error may enter my mind and my heart in many disguises. This I know. My anxieties, my fears, my ambitions, even my hopes and my dreams may deceive me into calling truth error and error truth. Always, I will seek the honesty and integrity that God yields to those who lay bare their lives constantly before him. And I just really love this little meditation, that it's so easy for us to get caught up in what's true and what's not. And I just love this picture of like laying our lives bare before God, and like He is the ultimate truth. And so I've come back to this a lot. I think it's a really helpful thing for us to kind of think about, and just think. And I like how he just says, like I'm not above finding out that I'm wrong. And I think that's something that's really hard for us as humans. And what a testament to our faith if we can be willing to say like, wow, look at what God's teaching me. Look at how I'm growing. And maybe sometimes I don't have it all right. So we can be curious, and that can help us grow. Adam Grant, he wrote a book called Think Again, which I think is really powerful. And he had this tweet a couple years, like last year, I think it was, that just showed some studies that he mentioned these studies that talk about how leaders who are willing to say they don't know create emotional safety for the people that they lead. And just how that helps our relationships when we're willing to say, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. Or I don't know, that he's talking about how it creates space for people to then feel safe enough to also say they don't know. And what a better conversation we can have about a lot of current issues in our world, right? A lot of things happen in very gray spaces, and I don't think they're all... We like things to be black and white, but sometimes they're not. And so I really love this idea of creating emotional safety for people by being willing to say that maybe we don't know everything. And I think that's really powerful. And like I was saying, there's a lot of research about confirmation bias. I'm not going to go into all of it, but we are more likely to dismiss credible information that calls our beliefs into question. So I think that's something to pay attention to, right? As people of faith who have strong convictions, that's just something for us to be aware of, like our own tendencies towards maybe we're like, nope, that can't be true, because we have a strong conviction about it. And that's something one of the ways we can guard against that, I'm going to give you a couple tools in a minute, is just by being willing to get our news from a variety of sources, right? Being willing to engage with different viewpoints. Again, I'm not asking anyone to give up anything that they believe, but just being willing to engage with some different perspectives. There is a podcast, if you like, I'm not a psychologist, but I have been diving really deep into a lot of these things because I think they're so fascinating and they really impact a lot of these topics. This is a podcast called Hidden Brain. It's really, really great if you like podcasts. And they go deep dives on all kinds of things related to psychology. And there was an episode called Moral Combat, very similar to confirmation bias. When we have strong moral convictions, we are less likely to see different perspectives. And because we see our moral convictions, like we see them as true. And so when we hear something different, and in this episode, they talk a lot about when you hear a different viewpoint from an authority figure, the psychology behind it is that people will question the authority of that person instead of their own beliefs. So it's easier for us to be like, well, that they just don't know what they're talking about, instead of saying, like, is there something I need to learn? And maybe there is and maybe there isn't, but am I willing to look at myself? And I just found that really fascinating, and I just really think the psychology behind all of these things is really interesting. And it's really actually kind of cool if you think about, like, God made us, God made our brains, right? Like how we work, like that's part of God's design as he created people. And so I think some of these topics related to psychology are really important and really interesting. So just a couple tools. If you're interested in wanting to engage outside your normal viewpoints, which I have just explained is very difficult, there are two companies that make these charts. I am not asking you to agree with how they have categorized news sources. What I like, so there's two of them. One is called allsides.com. They also have an app. And then another one is called the Advantes Media. And in both cases, they are rating different news sources. They have huge teams of people who do this that you can go on their websites and read all about their methodology. But they rate different news sources based on their political perspectives. I think it's worth noting everything has a perspective and everything has a bias. I actually don't love the center column because I think everything has a little bit of a bias. I don't think we can get away from that. I tell my college students all the time that they shouldn't be looking for the perfect source, but instead they should practice being able to identify the bias and then call that out. That's actually a better skill. And what I like about this chart is that it's a good check for me. So sometimes I might realize I am reading all my news from the same column. I actually think this is a more powerful tool for us to reflect on than to spend time well, that person over there, they're reading from that column. I can't believe it. I think it's so helpful for me to realize sometimes I start focusing on one thing and I am not paying attention to the other perspectives. And so I like that this is a tool. This is not a way to like get dogmatic about what news source is what perspective. I actually don't care about that. I think what is more important is, am I willing to just try reading some different things or watching some things? And it's hard. It's hard, right? Like we like we get comfortable depending on our perspective. This is a similar chart. You can look it up as well. They do basically the same thing. They also add in a little bit about which sources do a lot of fact reporting versus a lot of analysis versus a lot of opinion, things like that. They also, this one also rates podcasts and things like that. So I call these out as tools for us to reflect on our own behavior and our own information consumption, not as a way to judge other people or accuse them of not being good stewards. It's more about us and how we engage with the information. And so I want to kind of start wrapping up because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I have one last set of verses to read. As we think about all these things, right, as we think about the different filter bubbles we live in, as we think about the emotional content that we see online, as we think about the different perspectives that we see, ultimately, it's about how we engage with people well, how we love our neighbors. Our neighbors are online. Our neighbors are next door to us. They're reading their news. We're reading our news. How are we going to engage with them in a way that speaks to who God is and who Jesus is in our lives? And so I'm going to read this, and then we'll kind of wrap up. This is Colossians 3:12 through 17. It says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. In the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." And at the end of the day, all of this comes down to how we live our lives and how we love others. And practicing compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience in a world that is screaming with rude comments and fake news and misinformation is really hard. But I believe that, like at our church, we talk a lot about how God is already at work, right? He's working to redeem this world, and we get to join him in that work. And so what a privilege it is to practice those things. And it's hard, and that's where we can rely on the Holy Spirit to give us the compassion and kindness and humility, gentleness, and patience when we don't have it, for the people that we care about, online, in person, next door, across the street, in our churches, wherever they are. God is bigger than all of that. And they talk about this in that Holy Post podcast. We talk about it at my church too, right? God's going to make all the wrong things right someday. We know the end of the story. And that doesn't mean we sit back and watch this happen, but we get to join him in loving others. And that's a way that we bring redemption into the world. We bring healing by loving people well, by giving them compassion and kindness and speaking truth to them in a way that's caring and not just like, you're wrong, but we can do it in a way that's kind and loving and caring. And so that's my prayer for everyone, that as you read this book, as you think about these topics, that it would be about how do I bring God's compassion into my conversations? How do I bring his truth? How do I love other people well? It doesn't mean we let people believe misinformation necessarily, but how do we do that well? And I really trust that the Holy Spirit is going to guide everyone here as you think about it, right? The Holy Spirit can guide us in that and give us the strength to do that. When I was a missionary in Uganda, I lived there for 2 years in 2011 and 12, and then my husband and I, my husband is also a librarian, actually, and he and I went back in 2015, and we had the opportunity to work at a small theology school, a little tiny seminary together, and when we got there, we talked with the mission organization. We went with a group called Africa Inland Mission, and they were getting us on board, and they said, we've talked to some of our Ugandan partners, and we've said, for people who are here short-term or long-term, but especially, like, we were only there for 2 months, how can they be successful? Or like, what would be success, right? Like, what does that look like? How can our short-term missionaries kind of have an impact? And these Ugandans said, talk less, listen more, and focus on relationships. And that is so applicable to everything we do as Christians. It was applicable to my life in Uganda. It's applicable to me now. I just hired someone new this week, and I'm working really hard to not talk a ton, right? I want to get to know this new employee, and I got to focus on listening more. And it's a work relationship, but it's still like, how do I build this relationship with this person? And so talk less, listen more, focus on relationships, and I really believe that's how we see change, even in our online spaces. So I'm going to read, I have a couple resources for you, but before I do that, I just want to read this blessing. That's how I end my book. It's how I end kind of all my talks lately because it's so important. I'm just going to read this to you because it's just where I hope you'll leave. As we finish tonight, in the name of Jesus, may you be blessed with wisdom as you navigate your online spaces. May you be blessed with patience as you navigate hard conversations with your loved ones. In the name of Jesus, I bless you with the ability to find new ways to share the truth. And I bless you with perseverance to love others well and continue to seek humility and truth, even when it's hard. It's in those moments, I believe, that we'll become more like Jesus. And that's all I had for you. If you want some more resources, because I'm a librarian, I can't leave without a few other things. There's some things here. I can send the slides to you if you want to share them with people. These are some social media accounts to follow. If any of you are interested in current events and have not started following Sharon McMahon, she's from Duluth. She's fantastic. She describes current events in very clear, understandable ways, tries to be as neutral as possible. So that's one if you're interested in just like current events. My Instagram is the Faithful Fact Checking. That's where I try to post tips. I'm a little behind, but it is something I like to do when I can. If you listen to podcasts, I mentioned the Hidden Brain. Oh my gosh, I have a massive typo on there. Hidden Brain is a really great podcast. They just did a series called Us 2.0. They had 5 episodes about how to have hard conversations with people, and it was very well done. The Holy Post podcast is one I mentioned earlier, and then some other books if you're interested. Just so you have them. So that's all I had for you. Thank you for being here. I'm happy to answer some questions if there are any. Yeah.
Before we start the questions, can we get thank you so much, Rachel. We have a lot of questions back here, so I'll just start over here. Did I see a hand over here? Go back up. All right. Elgin.
I was in advertising, and we always tell the truth in advertising. But one of the things you may not believe, but we had, if we were going to run a commercial on television, we had to submit it for verification, and each claim had to be backed up fully and had to be vetted. Why don't we do that with articles ahead of time as opposed to after the fact?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point that I think is part of the big shift that we've seen in our online spaces is that in the past, there were so many more checks along the way, like you're describing, right? Before things got published, think about newspapers, right? They have an editor and then it goes to print. And we're living in a world where it's just very easy for people to create content. And there's no gatekeeper on that. Anyone can create an Instagram account and pretend that they are an expert. And so we do lose a lot of those checks that used to be in place. And that's definitely a big part of what we're seeing. There are a lot of articles that do have those checks, like a lot of research studies go through a peer review process and things like that. But we do have a lot of news sites that people have just created and they just can click publish. And that is one of the biggest challenges I think that we're seeing, is that it is very easy for people to create content, whether that's news or health information, right? I just talked to some college students about health information recently. It's really overwhelming because a lot of people look like experts. It doesn't take much to look like an expert. You can post online and there isn't always that. And that's hard because it puts more on us to do some of that checking. I didn't mention this, but there are also a lot of organizations working on how do we make online spaces more equitable? How do we make them more, like you're saying, like with, who controls this, right? There's a lot of organizations that are doing that kind of work, and I think they're really amazing. But yes, I agree with you. There's a lot of checks that we don't have in place anymore.
Why don't the Library Association, why don't they have their own website where it's only pre-checked stuff?
I wish we could do that.
It's called money.
What?
Money, right?
Yeah, it's really hard. We do have, most libraries, we do try to make sure that we're providing credible resources as best we can. The publishing process is also very complicated. That can make it hard for things to have access. There's a lot of things about access that are really, really challenging, even around that as well, so.
I can do this without. Oh, okay. It strikes me the concept of confirmatory bias is a theological problem for the church. Mm-hmm. And that I don't see the church confronting. Mm-hmm. I don't see the church clarifying its position. It's kind of a joke, actually, in some ways. 70% of white evangelicals are voting for Trump. Regardless of your political position, if you examine the ethic, the theology, where is the church in this? I don't think this is a psychological problem. Mm-hmm. I don't think this is me being kinder as a Christian. I think the opposite. I think it's me going to warfare. It's kind of like Clinton's comment about politics as a contact sport. I think bad theology is a contact sport. Mm-hmm. And as a psychologist who works in the forensic field for 40 years, I'm amazed at the naivety of the church in terms of psychopathic persons who, at the core, their ethic is the antithesis of anything the church would ever care about or understand or be for. And so my concern with your model is I think it assumes a certain naivete about how people are, what causes them to change, and exactly who it is we're trying to change. Psychopaths don't change. The research is abundantly clear. And so I think to some degree the balance is a more forceful theology vis-a-vis the Gospels, vis-a-vis Bonhoeffer, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just always troubled, particularly when I've been reading the Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. I don't know if you've read that book or not, but it's remarkable how despicable the church has been in the last 10 years in terms of its alliance with an ethic that violates every concept that's presented in the Gospels. Anyways, I'll shut up.
I'm curious your feeling about that as a theological issue.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to this. I am not a theologian. I'm a librarian, so I approach this from a information side of things, and this is what, as I've been talking about these ideas and kind of exploring them, these are the things that I keep hearing about. I don't disagree that there are theological issues. There are a lot of things that people are talking about and trying to wrestle with. And so I don't know that I have a very great response for you, but I appreciate certainly that there are a lot of issues at play here, and that it isn't, you're right, it's not enough to simplify it and just say be kinder. I recognize that. But I do think that there are a lot of things at stake, and there are pieces that we can choose to engage with, and there are a lot of pieces that are theological that I don't have an answer for.
Hi, thank you for your presentation tonight. And I haven't read your whole book, but I did get it a couple weeks ago, and I have read some of it, and I promise I'll read the rest of it. Just kind of pushing back a little on you about the church, and the church isn't perfect, and none of us are perfect. And the only thing, I look at the world and I get so frustrated, especially witnessing a bunch of stuff in third world countries with my traveling, watching people literally die on a street, or walk by them and they're alive, and I come back 2 hours later and they're dead. The world isn't perfect. And there's a lot of hurt and a lot of evil in the world. I have the opportunity. God has given me his grace. And with that grace, it's undeserved. Yet I have that. And all he wants me to do is to take that, learn from him with that, learn how to love myself deeper, and take that and spread that. And I can't go beyond that. Now, I look at Dennis Rodman. If anybody knows who Dennis Rodman was, he was a guard with the Chicago Bulls. They won 6 world championship rings. 3 years in a row, he was all-time world rebound champion. The guy off the court was just a nightmare. But on the court, he was phenomenal. One of the best forwards, one of the best 3 forwards in the NBA. Now, I'm not going to say anything other than when he did his job, he performed it well. But off the court, he was horrible. And I'm not there to judge. All I can do is gather as much information. And the other question I had in here, how many people in this room watch CNN, then go to Fox, then go to maybe CNBC, then go to American News? I do too. Because I jump all around because I want to hear that from all points of view, and that's excellent, absolutely excellent. So,
But are you reading the Wall Street Journal?
Just so that we're clear, I'm asking for questions. That's okay. That's 2 in a row, so that'll be enough commentary for tonight. We do have questions over here, I think. Go ahead.
2 questions. How do you deal with people who are just willfully ignorant? For instance, the flat earthers. Second, have you heard of anybody who's tried to make this presentation to right-wingers, like many evangelical churches? You're talking to a group of liberals here. Have you presented this same humble approach to finding information in a wild-ass evangelical church?
So first, to your first question, like how do we talk to people who are just willfully flat earthers? I think, and yes, this might be on the naive side, I don't know, but I feel pretty strongly that we are never going to convince everything to everyone. And so how can we approach those conversations carefully and kindly? And also, I think there is room for us to pay attention to the Spirit and who are we being asked to talk to about what and when, right? Like us trying to bulldoze people with information is probably not going to be effective. But there are things that we can pay attention to. There are a lot of tools out there about, sometimes it just takes a long time. And I think that there's a lot of us who want to be able to have a one and done conversation, and I just don't think that is realistic. So
For flat earthers, you would say engage. I would say chuckle and move on.
yeah, well, that's what I mean. Like sometimes there isn't a reason to talk about something, and sometimes there is. And I think I can't give anyone a checklist on when to have those conversations. I think that there's some room for us to decide who are the people that we're going to have those conversations with. And to answer your second question about, the different audiences that I've worked with, every church I've worked with has been a different denomination, including a lot of what would be considered more conservative denominations. And sometimes I don't know how people respond. That's not up to me. That is not my job to convince anyone that this is the right way to do everything. I believe this is what has kind of bubbled to the surface, and it's up to like the Holy Spirit to prompt people. But it has been a wide variety of folks, and it's been really fun. And a lot of those people, it's self-selecting. You all chose to be here too, and people self-select to come to these kinds of events, and regardless of their persuasion politically. But I do think there's a lot of nuance, and if people leave and say, I don't know, like, that's fine too. But it has been a wide variety, and it's been really cool to actually be able to engage with a wide variety of political ideologies, as well as theological, and have a lot of people saying, like, yes, this is something we're seeing and we want to figure out how to address. So
follow-up, you have presented to right-wing churches?
yes, but yes, yes.
And just so that we're clear, we're probably politically mixed in here, I think. So I'm not sure that we're one place or another. So, yeah.
I promise I won't pontificate, but I'm a Rotarian, and there's a credo called the four-way test. I don't know if I'm sure we've got some people in here that sort of is our mantra. The first is it the truth? Second is it fair for all concerned? Third is, will it build goodwill and better friendships, and will it be beneficial for all concerned? I will say it is, if you use that, I mean, it's hard to argue. I mean, I don't know, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's hard to argue with those four tenets. But if you apply that to a lot that we see going on, it's really difficult to reconcile how those values. Oh, I'm sorry, to reconcile with the fruition of those things. So I just want to make that point. The second point is, you probably are familiar with an organization. We actually had a meeting with one of the founders it used to be called Better Angels. It's now called Braver Angels. And their whole purpose is to try to bring people who are maybe diametrically opposed together. And one of the things they really emphasize is, no matter how different and how much counterpoint, is trying to learn and understand why they got to that point of view. Yeah. And even in the most extreme, they brought people, polar opposites, together and forced them to really try to learn about each other. And I think that is, I mean, indirectly you're alluding to that, but it has to begin with a willingness to be uncomfortable yourself. Right. And you can find out, even the people that are far, far away from you, you may end up just having at least a greater sense of acceptance, even though you don't agree with them, when you realize where they came from to believe and think that way.
Yeah, that's a great organization. I've been familiar with them.
I'm another librarian, by the way.
Oh, great.
Started out in schools and went back to school and retired as a medical librarian. But I am a news addict, and I wish I wasn't, but it is an addiction, and I like to know what's going on in the world. So I'm one of those people he mentioned over here that skips around and likes to see what everyone's take is on something or some story. And I would like to know what your assessment is of the integrity of the network news TV stations. You may not want to answer all of that, because you've given us some lists of sources to go into that are evaluating all of these organizations. A few are liberal, a few are conservative. I feel there's basically one that is fair and balanced, because that has been their motto from day one. In the last few days, NPR has been very much under scrutiny as not being fair and balanced, and one of their staff people has been a whistleblower, and I believe he's out now. And there are people talking about the government should not fund them anymore unless they can be fair and balanced. And there are networks that, and this really disgusts me to no end, that there are networks that won't even cover major news stories, and they claim to be news outlets. and they won't cover major news stories because it doesn't fit their narrative. And that happens all the time, and I see that all the time.
Jackie, did you have a question you wanted to ask her?
Yeah, I asked her what her assessment is of the different news TV networks.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're right, I'm not going to answer that. But what I will say is that the best journalists and news outlets, you can look up their statement of ethics. And that's really important to me, is to pay attention to that. So looking for where do they post that, it's on their website if they have it. If they don't, what does that tell us, right? So there are ways for us to evaluate those news sources by looking those up and seeing what do they say their standards are, what are their ethics. The New York Times, the Washington Post, right? They have those. Now, whether or not they're doing all of those things, not for me to say, but at the very least, we can look for those statements on whether they're network news or newspapers.
One of the comments I really appreciate your presentation tonight. I really appreciate. I'm with Tom. I've read most of your book. I don't know if I'm making the promise to finish it, but I really appreciate what I've learned. The one thing I think is really valuable is really the gist of this book and your presentation is for us. Is for us to evaluate what are we bringing into our hearts and minds. What are we evaluating? What are we listening to? What are the voices? I think it's one of the dangers in any of these kinds of presentations or any certain subject that we want to get on. We go, I'm loading up so I have information to deal with them, and I think that is important. I mean, we are in situations. It's helpful to have information so that we can enter into that conversation. But if there's something we need to win, I don't think that's the point of what your presentation is. I think the point is for you to say, here's some tools you can use so that you're gaining as close to the information that's going to be the most helpful for you. And I think that might be one of the big takeaways for us tonight. So.
Yeah.
I have a cousin that I speak with about once a month. And we have had conversations about politics, and we are on different sides. And finally, it dawned on me, I decided it's best to stop talking about it. And every conversation I end with, Gary, I just want you to know I love you.
That's a really beautiful example of, I think sometimes people think I'm advocating that, like, we do need to read all the news and pay attention to it, and that's true. But there are times where, like, maybe it's okay to say we don't need to talk about this, and that to me is the wisest way we can respond is paying attention to the promptings that we have from the Holy Spirit, which I would believe that's a prompting, right? Like, I'm actually not going to bring this up. I'm going to focus on how I care about you. That is a prompting from the Spirit, and I think that is the wisest way we can respond. And all of us will have slightly different responses because the Holy Spirit will prompt us in different ways. We have different relationships, and I think that's okay because at the end of the day, Jesus is still on his throne.
I think we might be done. I just wanted to say I really appreciated your book, particularly the personal ethical part, which I do feel like in some ways is the heart. I kind of approached the book, I was the one that chose it for the group and for this session as a way to talk about issues that of course are going to be live in our culture. But I also, as I was kind of reading it, I realized that there's a certain amount of helplessness that I think people feel. We all know that. I think I came in here the first night, and everybody kind of knew what fake news was, but how do we deal with it? Right, was sort of the question. And what I really appreciated again was the self-check, the emotional self-check, the bias self-check, all those things. I wonder though, also, and would be interested to know. I think there is a need for a kind of a larger sort of systemic critique, because most of this stuff is generated for money. at the end of the day. That's what this really is about. And I just wonder are there sources, resources, that you have found helpful as you've thought in that direction about sort of those bigger questions, because I think that also kind of connects to some of the comments that we were making earlier about going beyond just our own personal ethical response. Is there a bigger systemic analysis that we also need to do?
Yes, great question. Absolutely. There are bigger systemic cultural questions that need to be asked of our culture, of our society. Absolutely. And there are organizations that are doing really good work. One in particular that I really like is the Center for Humane Technology. They are doing really harsh critiques on, particularly around social media and things like, particularly around social media, I should say. So they are an organization that are doing a lot of work. They are the ones that produced the documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. Some of you may have seen that. So they are doing really good work. One of the other organizations I listed on here is called the News Literacy Project. They do a lot of workshops and things. That's what I listed here. But they also are doing a lot of advocating for a more comprehensive look at how people are taught to engage with the news, because I think there's a lot of pieces to it, right? It's the technology piece, it's how we're educated about technology, it's all of these layers that we need to address, and the News Literacy Project is doing really good work around that. There's also a book that came out a couple years ago called Algorithms of Bias that look at the bias that is programmed into our algorithms. I mean, if you want to talk about ending up in different places, that's another book that's really good. So there are a lot of people doing a lot of those critiques, and I just think it's so important. I think there's a piece that we have, and then there's this bigger piece, and there are a lot of great organizations and people that are writing about this and looking into it and researching and saying we need a more comprehensive look at how we educate people about this, how we create it, how we use it, how we manage it. So many layers that I think definitely are being addressed and need to be addressed.
That's
First source you mentioned?
The Center for Humane Technology.
And just before we go, are you working on another book? Are you working on version 2.0? Are you?
I am not currently working on another book. I love talking about these ideas. Just personally, I get my most ideas from talking to people. So I'm going to have to go to my car and write down all the questions you asked me. So as I talk to people, I get more ideas. I'm not currently working on another book though.
Well, please, again, let's thank our speaker. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you all for coming. This was our second and final for this year Faith and Justice Forum. This is where we come together to talk about issues that are of consequence for us and how Christians and people of faith or faithful people will respond to that. There will be some events that are going on in the summer. We'll let you know. Those of you who are on the mailing list, and if you're not on the mailing list and you're interested in looking at some of our visitors, if you're interested in hearing about what we're doing, please let me know. We'd love to take your email down. Let me pray us out of the room, and then we'll take off. Lord, we thank you so much for this day and this evening. We thank you for our speaker, Rachel, and for all of the hard work, the passion, the drive, and the constancy, the stick-to-itiveness to put this book together and to bring this to us, because it is very useful, it is enlightening, and it guides us in many important ways as we think about the question of what does it mean to be truth seekers and truth speakers. We ask and pray that you be with us now. Let us take away what is good and useful and leave behind what's not. In your name, amen.